March 1945. A bombed-out town near Trier, Germany. Cold rain falls from a heavy gray sky. Rubble fills the narrow streets. Bricks, shattered glass, and twisted metal block the path of advancing American forces. From inside the shell of a ruined house, an unexpected sound cuts through the damp air. It is the precise, haunting melody of a classical piano. Someone is playing a masterful rendition of Beethoven. The music rises from the broken walls and floats over the dead landscape, stopping hardened combat soldiers in their tracks. A four-star general approaches the doorway, his eyes fixed on the source of the melody. This single moment will force a fierce commander to choose between the brutal demands of military necessity and a sudden reminder of what the war is destroying. This is the story of how General George Patton encountered a brilliant 19-year-old Juilliard pianist playing classical masterworks on a battered upright instrument hidden inside the smoking ruins of a captured German town. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show humanity in the darkest places. Private First Class Samuel Bernstein was 19 years old. He came from the crowded streets of New York City, where the noise of subways and elevated trains filled the air. Before the draft board called his name, he spent his days in the quiet stone hallways of the Juilliard School. His hands were built for the long keys of a grand piano, trained by years of relentless scales and midnight practice sessions. He had enlisted at 18, trading his music scores for an M1 Garand rifle and a wool uniform. For 11 months, those hands had handled grease, cold steel, and digging tools instead of ivory. He had seen the muddy fields of France and the frozen forests of the Ardennes, losing 2 close friends to artillery fire along the way. The music inside him had gone completely silent, buried under the deafening roar of incoming shells and the steady thud of combat boots. Now he sat on a rickety wooden chair inside a shattered house, his fingers resting gently on the chipped keys of a forgotten German upright. Captain Charles Miller was 32 years old from Philadelphia, serving as a staff officer in the Third Army. He wore a crisp, clean woolen jacket with perfect creases and polished brown leather boots that had rarely stepped deep into frontline mud. Miller believed in absolute, unwavering military discipline above all else, viewing the war as a vast machine where individual feelings had no place. His ideology was simple. A soldier was a cog in a mechanism, and any deviation from duty was a threat to the entire advance. He carried himself with the quiet arrogance of a man who spent his days near headquarters, holding a clipboard rather than a muddy rifle. To Miller, a soldier sitting at a piano was a waste of army time and a dangerous distraction from the immediate tactical objectives. He stood outside the ruined building, listening to the classical notes with growing annoyance, eager to correct this breach of protocol. The Allied advance across Western Europe had reached a critical, frantic pace by the early spring of 1945. The German borders had been breached, and the Third Army was driving hard into the heart of the Rhineland. Entire cities were crumbling under the weight of heavy artillery barrages and relentless aerial bombing runs. The German defense was fracturing into isolated pockets of resistance, leaving behind a trail of ruined villages, burned fields, and abandoned strongholds. In the chaos of this rapid push, the normal structures of military occupation were stretched to their absolute limits. Supply lines were dangerously thin, communication wires were frequently cut by retreating forces, and thousands of displaced civilians clogged the muddy roads. Frontline troops often operated in a vacuum, moving quickly from one fiery engagement to the next, without time to process the destruction surrounding them. Many officers chose to ignore minor infractions, focusing entirely on maintaining the momentum of the advance and securing vital crossroads. They looked the other way, when exhausted men scavenged for extra rations or rested in the wreckage of abandoned homes. The sheer speed of the offensive made strict adherence to everyday peacetime regulations nearly impossible for commanders in the field. But near Trier, the sudden sound of classical music amidst the smoke presented a different kind of challenge to the rigid order of the military machine. Captain Miller stepped through the shattered doorway of the ruined house, his eyes fixed on the young private at the keyboard, determined to enforce the discipline that others had allowed to slip away in the fog of war. Miller stepped further into the roofless room, his boots crunching loudly on the broken glass. Bernstein did not look up, his fingers still moving gracefully across the keys. Miller slammed his clipboard against his thigh. "Private, stop that noise immediately," Miller said. Bernstein froze, his hands hovering over the piano as the final note faded into the open sky. He turned his head slowly, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep, blinking at the pristine uniform before him. "Sir, I found it in the debris," Bernstein said. Miller walked closer, his eyes scanning the rifle leaning against the masonry. "You are a soldier in the United States Army, not a performer in a music hall," Miller said. Bernstein lowered his hands to his lap, his voice barely a whisper. "I haven't touched a keyboard in 11 months, sir." Miller shook his head, his face hardening into an expression of disgust. "That is completely irrelevant. Private," Miller said. Bernstein gripped his knees, looking down at the keys. "I just needed to hear something beautiful for 4 minutes, sir." Miller pointed an angry finger at the instrument. "This instrument belongs to the enemy, and you are wasting valuable time that belongs to this command," Miller said. Bernstein stood up slowly, his body stiff from days of marching. "I am not neglecting my post, Captain. The perimeter is secure." Miller stepped directly into the private space, his chest expanding. "Do not argue with me, soldier. You are a rifleman," Miller said. Bernstein looked at his own calloused hands. "I was a student at Juilliard, sir." Miller let out a short, mocking laugh. "I don't care if you were the King of England before the draft board called you," Miller said. Bernstein remained silent, his arms tight at his sides. "Out here, you are a piece of government property designed to fire a weapon," Miller said. Bernstein stared at the officer's spotless boots. "This war is about efficiency and obedience, not classical culture," Miller said. Bernstein did not move or reply. "Step away from that machine right now and report back to your squad leader for extra detail," Miller said. Bernstein hesitated for a split second, looking back at the battered upright piano. Miller snatched the private's rifle from the wall and shoved it into the young man's chest. "Move out before I have you court-martialed for insubordination," Miller said. A young sergeant standing near the doorway watched the confrontation with a tense face, realizing the situation was escalating far beyond a simple training violation. The sergeant slipped away quickly to find the battalion commander's outpost down the street. The detailed report of the officer's rigid stance reached Patton within the hour. Patton arrived within the hour. His open-top Jeep pulled up directly to the edge of the rubble heap, the engine idling with a low, metallic growl. 4 silver stars gleamed brightly on his helmet, and the ivory grips of his revolvers caught the dull light filtering through the gray sky. Every soldier in the immediate vicinity stiffened, eyes darting toward the vehicle as the commander stepped out. He walked into the roofless room unannounced, his boots making no sound on the wet stone. He did not raise his voice, but his sudden presence filled the space instantly. Miller snapped to a rigid salute, his clipboard pinned against his chest. Patton studied him for a long moment, his eyes scanning the polished boots of the captain and then moving to the dusty keyboard. "What is happening here, Captain?" Patton asked. Miller cleared his throat, confident in his position. "Sir, I found this private neglecting his duties to play civilian music on enemy property," Miller said. Patton kept his gaze fixed on the officer. "And what was the private playing?" Patton asked. Miller blinked, looking slightly confused by the specific inquiry. "I believe it was Beethoven, sir, but it was a clear violation of active military discipline," Miller answered. Patton stepped closer, his voice remaining quiet but carrying an intense weight. "Did the music interfere with the defensive perimeter?" Patton asked. "No, sir, but a rifleman has no business engaging in concerts during an active advance," Miller said. Patton turned his head slightly toward the young private, who stood frozen at attention. "You believe this war is merely a matter of moving cogs in a machine, Captain. You look at this 19-year-old soldier, and you see nothing more than a mechanism designed to pull a trigger. You believe that your polished boots and your headquarters clipboard give you the authority to stamp out the last remaining remnants of human culture in this God-forsaken mud. The German nation we are fighting has spent years destroying everything beautiful in Western Europe. They have burned books, shattered monuments, and silenced the voices of great artists. We did not cross the Atlantic Ocean to mimic their destruction or to crush the rare gifts of our own people. This young man was trained at the Juilliard School in New York City. He spent years mastering a craft that requires more discipline, more precision, and more dedication than you have ever shown in your entire military career. He has carried his rifle through the mud of the Ardennes, and he has earned the right to touch those keys. You have a choice, Captain. You can sit down on that wooden chair right now and listen to this private perform another piece. Or you can spend the rest of this campaign personally clearing the rubble from this road with a handheld shovel. Decide now. Miller stood motionless for 3 seconds, his face turning completely pale under his helmet. He looked at the 4 stars on Patton's chest, then looked down at the dusty keys of the upright piano. Without speaking another word, the captain carefully placed his clipboard on a broken brick wall and sat down on the rickety wooden chair. The staff officer sat stiffly on the dust-covered chair, his back perfectly straight and his hands pressed tightly against his uniform trousers. Private Bernstein raised his calloused hands once more over the keyboard, paused for a single breath, and began to play a delicate waltz by Chopin. The smooth, flowing melody filled the ruined space, bouncing off the 3 standing brick walls and lifting toward the open gray sky. Patton stood completely motionless in the center of the debris, his silver-starred helmet held respectfully in his right hand as the cold rain misted over his face. He watched the private's fingers move with effortless grace across the chipped ivory keys, completely ignoring the muddy environment. Several frontline infantrymen from the squad gathered silently around the outer perimeter of the blown-out structure, their muddy faces turned toward the unexpected sound of classical music. They stood shoulder to shoulder in the damp air, holding their heavy rifles loosely, mesmerized by the beautiful performance. The captain kept his eyes locked straight ahead, listening to every single note under the cold gaze of the general. For 5 continuous minutes, the melody drowned out the distant rumble of moving military transport trucks and heavy machinery on the main road. No one spoke, no one moved, and the tense discipline of the command melted completely into the peaceful rhythm of the classical piano piece. When the final musical notes faded into the rainy sky, the general stepped toward the instrument and looked down at the young private. He told him that when this conflict was over, he must return to the Juilliard School and finish what he started, because the world needed his musical gift more than the army needed another rifleman. Patton then turned to his personal aide and gave a direct command to make a specific note regarding Private Bernstein. He ordered that if the young man survived the campaign, his official military discharge papers must explicitly mention his classical musical training, so that future authorities would know exactly what kind of talent was carrying a weapon in the mud. Bernstein survived the final months of the war, returned safely to New York City, and completed his studies at Juilliard. He lived a long and productive life as a professional musician before passing away in New York in the year 1998, never forgetting the 4-star commander who stood in the ruins. Captain Miller remained with the staff unit until the conclusion of hostilities, later transitioning to a quiet corporate career in Philadelphia, where he died in 1982. Rarely speaking of his time in the Rhineland, Patton kept a brief private account of the incident recorded in his personal diary, noting that a nation without art was not worth fighting for. The general once mentioned to a close associate that the finest melody he heard during the entire European campaign came from a broken keyboard in a ruined town. Some historians have argued that Patton's display of unexpected mercy in the ruins of Trier was a calculated public relations gesture designed to soften his reputation as a ruthless commander who viewed his men purely as cannon fodder. They suggest that his well-documented love for classical music and European history allowed him to indulge his own personal tastes under the guise of battlefield justice. Others argue the opposite, maintaining that the incident was a genuine expression of a deeply hidden compassion, proving that the general understood the immense human cost of the conflict better than his critics. What is certain is that the encounter preserved the life and career of a brilliant young musician, leaving behind a permanent record of an American commander who refused to let the brutal realities of war completely destroy the finest achievements of human culture. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same, or would you have demanded the soldier return to his post immediately? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about humanity in the darkest places, make sure to subscribe.